I'm Kirsteen Macdonald. I'm the guest curator of the exhibition in Gallery 1 called Chinbin Western. It's a solo exhibition of work by the Japanese artist Chikako Yamashiro. Chikako's an artist who works with performance, video and film, and photography, very much based in narratives and ideas that come from her homeland in Okinawa, which are a group of islands far from the mainland of Japan. So the title itself, Chinbin Western, marries together these two cultures that exist side by side in Okinawa. The Western being a reference to the American film genre, but also the position from which I'm speaking, the Western position that views onto Japan and onto Okinawa. And the other half of the title, Chinbin, refers to a local delicacy, which is a very sweet brown sugar being one of the biggest crops on Okinawa. It's a brown sugar pancake, like a crepe. And that's served in the film to one of the protagonists, one of the characters in the film, alongside an American bourbon whiskey. So she's placing together these very symbolic pieces of reference to different cultures that are coexisting in Okinawa. And then the film itself pulls out through, I guess, some of the strands of the idea, like the modes of storytelling she uses, very much draw from other forms of culture. So first you have the sort of melodrama and the high drama in the film, which is taken from the American Western genre, particularly spaghetti westerns, which again are like a hybridization of different cultural takes in the production of a film genre. So she's using the kind of melodrama of the saloon scene in the Western film as a way of citing a kind of dramatic core to the film. But she also in the film draws from indigenous culture, from traditional cultural forms like the play, which is enacted at the end of the film, which comes from a very, the costumes and the language used in that play both come from the pre-Japanese colonization of Okinawa, from the time when Okinawa was part of the Ryukyu kingdom. So that traditional form of language and that traditional form of costume and play produces another form of explicit storytelling device within the film that sits alongside the idea of popular film culture, alongside culinary culture and various other strands of reference. But Chikako and I met in Okinawa and spent some time together talking about the context of working here in Scotland. She was really interested in the conversations we had about land ownership and about conflicts around the kind of political agency that people have over their own land and their own ability to organise that politically and geographically. Because of the huge military presence in Okinawa, which has a huge number of American military bases, there are historically very difficult relationships between the Japanese government and the Okinawans, alongside the American government and the Japanese government. So there are really huge geopolitical forces at stake in the way that Okinawans can live their everyday lives. And the economic basis of the islands is very much driven by that military presence from America on the islands. Chikako's work has often responded to that, not telling literal stories about the political situation, but using those as a way of enticing more impressionistic stories about the way that might feel or the way that might move through the experience of living in a place like Okinawa. So when we met there and talked about the idea of doing an exhibition in Scotland, the initial idea was for her to come to Scotland. And we planned a research trip, which meant that she would have had time in Dundee and around Faslane and the west coast of Scotland, looking at the protests and issues around the nuclear defence system that's based in Scotland, as a kind of parallel story to the one that exists in Okinawa with the American military bases there. Unfortunately, because of COVID-19, she wasn't able to travel last spring, and we've still not been able to realise that visit to Scotland. I think what's so interesting in Chikako's work is the way that she deals with contemporary issues. She deals with the very precise politics of a place, but she transforms that in her artwork into a way of moving beyond what might be understood purely through language or through a kind of narrative that describes something. And the work is more connected to ideas of feeling. And for me, that links into particular ways of thinking about the way that society is constructed, whether that's through the organisation of people genetically into family groups, or whether that's into wider community groups. And one of the things which comes into play, and it is part of the extended title for Chinbin Western, the subtitle being Representations of a Family, or The Family, that family features the main human characters in that film are based around two family units. So one is a father, a mother, and two small children, and the other family unit is a young artist and her grandfather. So there's a missing generation within that household. And it would be very common to presume within the economics and the kind of rural life that's depicted in that part of Okinawa in the film, that those parents have probably gone somewhere else to seek work, that there isn't enough sustainable work within that rural community for all three generations of that family to still be living within the household. So it plays off different presentations of the way in which we find ourselves organised in family units, and leaves us to speculate about why that might be. Another thing which happens in terms of the gender representations is that I'm not speaking from a perspective of someone who understands all of the context and all of the symbolism and all of the characteristics of this work. I can only understand what's translated to me, and obviously to some degree things are lost in translation. So my communication with Chikako has been through translation. Neither of us speaks each other's language. So we've had a very long, slow and written communication over the development of this show, which is the first time I've had to work this way. It's very unusual. So I've done a lot of reading around the subjects involved in her film, as well as communication with her and the people she works with directly. But that intervention means that some of the slippages of those symbols or meanings or linguistic turns of phrase don't come through either for the viewer in terms of the use of subtitles. One of the other things which is really interesting in the earlier works in the exhibition is that they're not always subtitled. And that's the same for Japanese viewers. So often the language which is happening, which you imagine as a Western viewer, you're just not understanding the content of the language. For Japanese viewers, that could also be the case because there are local dialects being woven into the work, and there are often uses of language where it's not entirely clear exactly what's being said. There's sort of mumblings. They're almost like moving into a more spiritual space of a kind of beckoning or calling or recalling, which is more connected to kind of spirit life than it is to kind of living life. So the character in Sinking Voices, Red Breath, in the first gallery, the older lady who speaks and kind of mutters into this group of microphones, which are then dropped into the ocean. She isn't necessarily speaking to be understood. She's speaking to be heard and to be listened to more than anything else. And that idea of testimony is very important in Chikako's work. Now, she had developed both of those short films after a collaborative project she undertook in an elderly daycare centre in Okinawa, where she spent a long time, over a year, speaking with residents of Okinawa who were the same age as her grandparents. So they came from the generation that had direct experience of the trauma of the Second World War and the kind of after effects of the massacres and suicides which occurred during the Second World War in Okinawa. It was the only part of Japan where there was land battle during the Second World War, and there were, within a very short period of days, there were a huge number of deaths and atrocities. And this underpins so much of the understanding of how Okinawan culture today operates, and it's impossible to understand without understanding that history as well. Chikako had set out to work with that group of older residents as a way of understanding better, but not understanding necessarily through the words that they were speaking, but understanding through being close to them and spending time with them and feeling the feelings that they were feeling as they were recounting their experiences of the past. So she talks about that experience as being a way of memory moving through her body. So the video work then is a way that the memory moves from their bodies through her body, through the medium of the video, into a kind of visceral space in the exhibition that we could start to understand through our bodies. It doesn't necessarily have to be that we understand the words that are being spoken, but we could stop and listen and take time to kind of feel the sensations that are around the sound and the image and the voices that she's incorporated into those works.